Hello everyone, so in this video I'm going to be talking about the first review topic that I introduced to you guys today, which is climate change. And specifically I wanted to take the AP Government and AP Microeconomics content that we reviewed today and apply them to the topic for today. In hopefully a more succinct way than I did in class, so that way it's a very valuable resource for you. So let's get started. So first I introduced you to the IPCC report, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report, which is kind of this leading authority on climate change research in the world. And we talked a little bit about the detrimental effects of climate change and some of the effects that climate change has had and we can expect it to have. Before I get into the Paris Climate Accord, I want to go ahead and introduce some core government content that we went over today, which was political ideologies. So we talked about conservatism and liberalism, and in particular, I want to talk about the economic aspects of those ideologies, just for brevity. So with conservatism, which is predominantly associated with the Republican Party, we're really going to be talking, in this column you notice I'll put pre-Trump, because Trump kind of complicates things a little bit. But the ideology, the belief system espoused by conservatives was the suspicion of government. I can summarize it in a phrase that was articulated by Ronald Reagan, that government is not the solution to our problems, government is the problem. So they had this more laissez-faire approach to the economy, meaning just leave it alone, minimize government intervention, tended to be more hostile to welfare programs like unemployment and labor unions. Liberalism, we kind of categorized as the government can positively affect people's lives, especially with disadvantage, and they tended to embrace labor unions and welfare programs, at least historically. Right? That kind of changes in the Clinton era. Things get so complicated when you deal with ideologies because you also don't need to practice your ideology once you govern, so it's even more complicated. But Trump, we said, was a right-wing populist, and we defined populism as the style of politics that emphasizes a defined people over an elite. It can be left-wing populist, it can be right-wing populist. There's populists all around the world. But we said right-wing populists didn't have an emphasis on national sovereignty and borders, suspicion of political elites and international organizations and foreigners, and concerned with perceived community decline. Critical for that economic ideology piece that we wanted to emphasize today is that they're okay with government intervention in the economy, particularly with respect to trade. Okay, so those are the ideologies. Then we talked about the Paris Climate Accord. We talked about the limitations and sort of like some of the benefits of the Paris Climate Accord. So moving on. We talked about the fact that President Obama felt constrained by the political reality of the United States when he was in office at the time. And so he decided to sign an executive agreement. The Paris Climate Accord was not a treaty. A treaty would require 2/3 of US senators to ratify it, and a treaty would be harder to withdraw from. It was rather an executive agreement, meaning that the president committed to install government policy, or American policy, to ensure that American policy reduced greenhouse gas emissions to the nationally determined targets that the Obama administration came up with. So it was essentially weaker than a treaty. Then we saw the video of Trump withdrawing from the Paris Climate Accord and the rationale that he gave. And then I asked you to think about how their ideologies might into how the way they acted. We saw some of the international reaction. And then we used some of the economic concepts that we've developed in some of the later units, more recently externalities, to think about climate change. And so right here on the left, we can see what is called a negative production externality. And an externality, we said, is a market failure. And we made this assumption. It's called the first welfare theorem of economics. Sort of a big phrase. But the idea is that markets, when you leave them to their own devices, in perfectly competitive markets, absent a market failure, that they will produce the social welfare maximizing quantity. And they will operate in equilibrium, right? And so an externality is one type of market failure, where the cost or benefit of a market transaction between producers and consumers is not just internalized by the parties engaged in the transaction, but is externalized, meaning somebody also bears the consequences of your actions. And so on the left, we have a classic negative production externality, right? And the way that we represent production externalities is we say, or externalities in general, is we say there's either a gap between the private marginal cost curve and the social marginal cost curve, meaning there's either a gap between the actors' perceived cost of their action and society's perceived cost of their action, or there's a gap between the private marginal benefit curve and the social marginal benefit curve, meaning a gap between demanders of whatever that good or service is action, and society's perceived benefit associated with that action. So this is a negative production externality. And we can see this in specifically when we think about coal-fired power plants or any type of production market where a byproduct of production is the burning of fossil fuels. And so here we represent this negative production externality as the social marginal cost curve is above the private marginal cost curve. We can see the story that this graph tells us is that we're producing at Q1, but society would prefer us to produce at Q2, and we have this deadweight loss triangle of market transactions that are taking place. We're actually overproducing, and society would rather have us not engage in those terms, those are market transactions. We discussed some solution to externalities. We said taxes, subsidies, or laws. And some of you said that maybe you should just tax people that are polluting. And so therefore you could shift the private marginal cost curve so it aligns with the social marginal cost curve, and we're producing at the socially desirable point. And on the right, we have a negative consumption externality. When you draw the deadweight loss triangles, by the way, the triangle is always going to be pointing towards the socially optimal point, where we can see that the demand curve, D equals private marginal benefit, and the social marginal benefit curve, there's a gap. And so we can tell this story, let's go ahead and tell the story with, by looking at the market equilibrium. So at Q1, that's what we're actually consuming and producing, and at Q2, that's what society would rather us consume and produce. And so we have overconsumption. And we can think about this in the market for vehicles, or the market for cars. So society would rather us buy less gas because the externality of burning carbon dioxide right, imposes a cost on society, right, with climate change. But we buy more, the private markets buy more than is socially desirable. So there's this gap, right? And so we can see this deadweight loss triangle represents market transactions that society would rather us not partake in, but nonetheless we partake in. And again, another solution to this externality is laws, subsidies, taxes, right? Changing the incentive structure so that way we can shift the private marginal benefit curve so it aligns with the social marginal benefit curve. Okay, awesome. Then we talked about the prisoner's dilemma to help think about the precarious nature, that's an ACT word, the sort of fragility or the difficulty in both creating what is called a multilateral international agreement, meaning an international agreement between more than just two parties. And in this game theoretic kind of structure, this payoff matrix, we only have two countries, right? So we can even see the incentive to deviate from a cooperative state at play here. And so I'm just going to run through this really quickly. We can imagine a world in which there are only two countries. Obviously, there's closer to 200. So getting a climate deal is very, very difficult. And we can sort of play this game out. The numbers reflect utils. And so we're trying to maximize, trying to get the biggest number possible. And so we can play this game out. Let's see if you can pause and play this game out. But what we're going to find is that the dominant strategy for both the United States and China is to stay the course, and they arrive at the Nash equilibrium right here, and the solution to the game. Remember, Nash equilibrium reflects this idea that both players have no regrets pursuing the strategy that they did, given what the other player does. And so this is the solution to the game that we expect, right? And so what we can think about is we can, I didn't go solve but because I'm short on time and I want to move on, but this is the Nash equilibrium to the game. So see if you can actually solve the game. You should get two circles in this square right here, but the way that you would solve the game is you would, for instance, start with China and think about what is China's best response if the United States decides to stay the course, and you compare the first number, which reflects the payoffs of the row player, and -400 would be the first circle. Then you move on, so on and so forth, and you should arrive at the Nash equilibrium and realize that China's dominant strategy is to stay the course, not reduce CO2 emissions. So is the United States' dominant strategy. That leads to a suboptimal outcome. So it's sort of getting at this idea that cooperation is very, very hard, very, very difficult. That's how we can use the prisoner's dilemma, this economic concept, and apply it to the topic of climate change. We can use the externalities, those economic concepts, and apply it to the topic of climate change. We can use political ideologies and apply it to the topic of climate change, and thinking this sort of rationale, the belief system that undergirds the thinking of two heads of state in President Trump and President Obama. And then the last thing we talked about is we talked about executive orders.